WashingTECH.
There's a lot of this information mismatch that's happening, and really, I think could lead to, or should lead to, more of an understanding about what the space is, how it operates, what it's doing, to create a more hospitable environment to growth.
Are you worried about your kids' safety on the internet? We are here to help. WashingTECH's 5-step checklist will take you through the process of protecting your kids, and will give you tips on how to set up the best parental controls for your children on their devices. You want what's best for your children. They deserve to be safe online. Our step-by-step guide will help you make sure they are. Download WashingTECH's online safety checklist today to protect your kids online. Find it at protectyourkids.online. That's protectyourkids.online.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
WashingTECH, safe and informed since 2014.
My guest today is Roger Quiles, one of the world's first esports and gaming attorneys, beginning to serve the industry exclusively in 2015. His work services all stakeholders in the industry worldwide. Roger also sits on the Board of Latinx in Gaming, a nonprofit dedicated to elevating the Latinx community in the video gaming industry. Roger Quiles. Roger, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Joseph.
The esports industry is growing in ways all of us should be aware of. New privacy and information integrity issues we've yet to envision or fathom. So I appreciate your taking the time to give us an overview of your practice. So let's start there. Roger, tell us about what your work focuses on.
Sure. So my practice is exclusively an esports and gaming law firm. So what that means is we take an industry-oriented approach towards providing legal solutions. So we lead with our business foot, understanding the many issues that the various stakeholders within the industry face, and understanding what their goals are and how that's typically accomplished in the industry. And then we work backwards from there to apply legal solutions to that. Now, what always gets tricky, of course, in like any technology or any new technology innovation or platform, is existing law doesn't always exactly align with what tech is doing. So it's always a little bit of a constant sort of square peg round hole issue, and looking to figure out how we can best apply precedent in any particular field, be it IP, commercial contracts, M&A, and the like, to these new innovations and new ways in which that people are engaging and competing with one another. So that's the sort of 60-second overview in terms of a typical sort of clientele. On the individual front, we deal a lot with talent, be they content creators like Twitch streamers, YouTubers, Instagram creators, TikTokers, as well as players, those being the competitive players participating in esports tournaments and events. So our work for them is largely probably most closely similar to talent counsel for an athlete or an entertainer. Then on the business end of things, our work is much more akin to outside general counsel. So we quarterback, we address any of their existing issues, be they corporate, M&A, IP, some employment, and then also outsource any sort of niche or very localized work that needs to get done there. So we can certainly translate the esports and gaming to outside counsel, and then translate the legalese back to the client.
So what about these policy issues and these regulatory issues? I mean, certainly that's impacting how you advise your clients from a business perspective. What are some trends in the world of esports and where it overlaps with things like privacy, and what are the issues when it comes to online safety? How does what's happening in these debates happening in Washington affect your clients, and especially with this patchwork of state regulations around privacy, not to mention international regulations? How are you thinking about that?
So from a company perspective, certainly consumer privacy debates have been a very hot topic. How does this industry is inherently international and inherently also interstate. So if we are aggregating data from consumers, how is that data being treated? How does that data move? And that certainly implicates all sorts of data privacy issues on the consumer end of things. The GDPR has become a very scary term to a lot of clients, especially when they first realize that they actually are subject to GDPR, whether they like it or not, in many instances. And that the level of compliance involved there is pretty significant. So it's somewhat of an undertaking and an education that needs to happen there. On an individual basis, something that I've become increasingly aware of is just how little individuals are aware of what data about them is available online, and in many cases freely available online. That's become a huge point of concern for many content creators as well as players. And just not having any sense of what's out there. The reason why, in particular, why this becomes a point of concern is these people are celebrities. There's no way around that. And in dealing in a digital first environment, the fans of those celebrities or the people consuming their content are much more tech savvy and much more digital savvy. So they may be much more aware of where they can find this information, and how they can then utilize that is, the sky's the limit. So you have unfortunate situations of many stalking situations. There was one instance, even I believe in June, of an individual flying across the world, selling all their worldly possessions to declare their love for a content creator, and posted up outside of their house. Tried to get into the house. And you have other instances of swatting, which has been incredibly common within the gaming space. For those that are unaware, swatting is when someone calls the police and calls 911 and informs them that there is some sort of violent disturbance going on at your residence, so that the police then send a SWAT team to your house at the hope of potentially getting you arrested or having something happen that's particularly having law enforcement even appear on stream if they're currently streaming while that happens. That's actually even resulted in some unfortunate loss of life because the police actually believed there was a hostage situation occurring in an instance. And all it takes in that instance is having an IP address and then being able to track that IP address. So it's so on an individual level, especially with talent, part of what I do is a lot of educating around just their data and their privacy and how they seek to shield that from the rest of the world, because not only is their livelihood potentially in jeopardy from something like a GDPR issue where you have data exposed, but also their physical well-being can be at stake in some of these instances.
That is, I saw a documentary about the swatting issue and I was just floored. I had no idea that was even happening. So now, what are some specific pointers, 3 or 4 pointers that you have for folks who may or are in a position to be potentially victimized in the ways you just described?
I would say first and foremost, be aware that you don't know everything. I think you need to get out of your own sort of knowledge box and do some digging, or have someone else do some digging, right? What information is out there about me? What can be found about me? And then the next step from there is, based on whatever you find, how can we shield that? Can we shield that? Do we do so via using business entities, putting those in place? Do we buy our home under a blind trust? Or do we, hell, for some, do we even have a publicly viewable marriage license. There's a lot that they don't know. So getting an assessment of that and getting help to get an assessment of that to then be able to manufacture solutions to protect that is step one for me, especially on the talent and individual side of things. With respect to companies, I know the scary word is always compliance, right? Because seemingly for them, it's every other day there's something else that they need to adhere to, and they just want to do well at their, at whatever it is that they're providing. So compliance can be a very scary topic, but that means being clued in with the right people to help ensure that compliance. And it's always the heaviest lifting that you do up front, right? In terms of creating your policies, understanding what your compliance obligations are, but then once you have those things set in place and you have some key people to be able to monitor that and to ensure that compliance ship keeps operating as it should, then that actually becomes a lot easier, right? It's always easier to tweak and fine tune as we have amendments, as we have some new legislation that comes in, albeit in a piecemeal fashion, than to overhaul an entire privacy compliance initiative. So that would be the second thing, or the first on the corporate end. I think beyond that too is then also understanding the interplay, right? Of these issues don't ever exist in a vacuum, right? If you're doing anything online, especially cross-border, you're inherently going to be triggering multiple different regulatory schemes, right? So you may be aware of, or maybe it's more obvious that you're dealing with things like tax issues, with potential content regulation, things of the sort. But oftentimes the privacy component, especially on the consumer end, isn't something that jumps out or isn't something that comes to mind. So keeping a client or educating them to be more aware of when privacy implications may be coming into effect. That way, they're able to take the appropriate steps and to avoid any potential headaches down the road.
You're plugged into the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
So let's talk about career paths. There are a lot of folks interested in gaming, a lot of folks who are interested in advancing their careers. So why not combine the two, right? What's a typical career path for working as an esports lawyer? And how would you assess the level of competition versus opportunity in this space?
So I'll tackle the competition and opportunity side first. I think the level of competition on a broad scale is pretty low. There are not many attorneys that are solely practicing within this space. There are a lot of attorneys that market within the space or hold themselves out as participating in the space, yet many of which don't seem to be actively participating. So take that as it may. But in terms of opportunity, this is a very, very broad industry, and it is a growing industry both in terms of height and width. So the industry is growing in all directions. There's new games every day. There's new teams every day. There's new content creators every day, which is great because it means that there's this ever-expanding realm of new content and new games and people doing things in different ways. You don't have, not all games look alike, which is great because then not all tournaments look alike, and then not all attorney skill sets need to look alike. And to dovetail that into the question of what sort of, is there a typical career path for an attorney entering into esports? And there really isn't. I mean, certainly there are some areas of the law which would lend themselves more towards a practice in esports. Intellectual property is ever present, right? You're dealing in an entirely digital space, so you need a very strong background in copyright, trademark, and licensing. Commercial contracts are always a good bread and butter, right? I mean, everything is a deal in one capacity or another. Employment also helps if you're going to be working with teams or if you're going to be representing individuals. Corporate is always a good background also if you're working with the many types of businesses that operate in the space. Lord knows there's been a ton of merger and acquisition activity in the last few years in and around the space. So much like traditional sports, you tend to see every vertical of law existing in the esports space. I mean, even if you did something like facilities, if you handled facilities issues with respect to like arenas or stadiums and the like, there's now, especially in the United States, a significant number of esports venues that have been specially built for that special purpose. So, there's seemingly always a niche that that esports can hold within any of those verticals. I mean, even immigration is a huge one that may not immediately come to mind, but certainly the movement of players and casters and everything else all exists on an international basis. So how do you operate internationally? How do you make money internationally? Well, you need to be under the correct visa scheme or the appropriate visa scheme to do so. So, there's a wealth of opportunity within that space. May not necessarily all be as lucrative as the other. There may be some fields that are, tend to lend themselves to more what attorneys may consider to be more typical hourly rates and such. But nonetheless, there is a need across every vertical.
Might as well just become an electrician. So what are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us, Roger, before we close? And where can we find you online?
Sure. So some final thoughts is, I would say from a regulatory perspective, I think there is a significant need to understand what is happening in gaming and esports. There's always that narrative of, hey, we have some incredibly unfortunate situation of let's say a mass shooting or the like. And first question a lot of people ask is, what type of media did they consume? Were they listening to violent music? Were they playing violent video games and the like? And frankly, a lot of that is overblown, but in my opinion. But even just from a business standpoint, there's a mismatch between existing regulation and how the industry exists and operates. And, as an industry, we're seeking to fit ourselves into these old structures, be they tax regimes, be they even immigration categories and the like, and how these various things interplay with one another in a society, in a current society, when the law as it was written did not anticipate any of these existing issues. Easy example of that is something like loot boxes, which is in-game mechanic where people can buy effectively like a digital pack of trading cards. So there's been much made of whether or not this constitutes gambling. Well, if that's gambling, why can I go down to my corner store and buy Pokemon cards and that not be gambling? So there's a lot of this information mismatch that's happening, and really, I think could lead to or should lead to more of an understanding about what the space is, how it operates, what it's doing, to create a more hospitable environment to growth, and also even a more accessible environment to growth. Because I think not knowing sort of what's appropriate and what isn't holds a lot of people back in terms of how they want to enter into a venture that's being involved in the space. But yeah, that to me is the biggest takeaway. And this is not a U.S. issue. This is a global issue because esports is global. So I'm happy to chat about esports at any time, or my practice, or what it means to even be an esports and gaming attorney. You can find me on Twitter at Roger Quiles. That's Quiles, and always up for good conversation.
Roger Quiles is founding partner of Quiles Law based in New York City. Roger, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
WashingTECH.